long-range strategic air force. All these factors together, economic destitution, public indifference, and inter-service discord, produced an ugly, ineffectual, and small air force that offered scant promise of being able to influence events abroad. This was of considerable concern to Roosevelt on November 14, 1938. German nationalism was, for the second time in as many generations, pushing Europe toward another war. Just 2 years earlier, in March 1936, Nazi Germany broke terms established at Versailles and reoccupied the demilitarized zone in the Rhineland. Austria was annexed 2 years later in March 1938, and less than 2 months before Roosevelt called the meeting, on September 30, 1938, France and Britain had capitulated at Munich, sanctioning Hitler's annexation of the Czech Sudetenland. Following that shamefulness, Roosevelt can perhaps be forgiven for not believing Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, when he declared that peace in our time had been secured. Through it all, Hitler's persecution of his nation's Jews became more overt. That fact was underscored with terrible clarity just shortly before Roosevelt called the meeting. On the night of November 9th through 10th, state-sponsored mobs killed nearly 100 German Jews and burned thousands of businesses and synagogues in what came to be known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. When Roosevelt called his top advisers to him in mid-November, there was a real fear that Europe was tilting toward another catastrophic conflict. He certainly did not know at the time that the United States would be sucked into the fight, but he did know that its Air Force, the U.S. Army Air Corps, was ill-prepared for such an eventuality. He further knew that even before Hitler's blitzkrieg showcased the terrible potential of the warplane, the United States could never hope to prevail in a war with its pitifully inadequate Air Corps. Roosevelt meant to correct that inadequacy as soon as possible. In fact, during the weeks immediately following Munich, Roosevelt energized his staff to create an expanded Air Force. This included a meeting on October 14th and a press conference that justified growing the Air Corps based on changing world dynamics. The meeting on November 14th included Hap Arnold. As chief of the Air Corps, his presence was a prerequisite. But he was only the chief of the Air Corps. What Roosevelt wanted done would take far more horsepower, far more expertise, far more experience than Arnold alone possessed. Harry Hopkins, who headed the Works Progress Administration and was one of the president's staunchest and most stalwart lieutenants, also attended, as did Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau. Also present, among others of Roosevelt's most powerful men, were Lewis Johnson, the Assistant Secretary of War, Malin Craig, Chief of Staff of the Army, and Craig's eventual successor, George Marshall. What the President wanted was an unprecedented expansion of the U.S. Army Air Corps. Although he envisioned and desired a much larger organization, he was realistic about what Congress would fund. Still, what he actually proposed was much grander than what any air advocate at that time believed realistic. Specifically, Roosevelt called for 10,000 new aircraft to be built and delivered within 2 years. He directed that 8,000 of those machines be produced in existing factories and that 7 new government aircraft plants be built. 5 of those factories were to be mothballed for future use, while the other 2 were to be put to work immediately to produce the remaining 2,000 aircraft. Recall that the Air Corps possessed only 1,600 aircraft at that time. The President's men left the gate at full tilt. Roosevelt's direction was bold, but it was not detailed, and appeared to be almost naive. The Air Force that he outlined would be useless without the infrastructure and personnel to support and man it, yet he had said little on the subject. Consequently, Arnold and his staff went for broke. They took it upon themselves not only to do the planning required to produce the aircraft the President called for, but also to lay the groundwork needed to assemble all the pieces: personnel, airfields, training facilities, logistics pipelines, and other elements, to make the expanded Air Corps a viable force. Roosevelt was irate when the scheme for producing the 10,000 aircraft, together with all the components required to operate them, was presented. It was too expensive and included provisions for much more than the aircraft.